Good afternoon. My name is Caleb Brown, but most of you probably know me as Coach Brown. This semester, I challenged my students to create a documentary. The work that you're about to see is their work and their work alone. They wanted to honor our local veterans and honor our great nation. They've worked very hard. I hope you enjoy what you see.
And I've often described my experience as being kind of like Charles Dickens describes, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the best of times in developing the relationships with my Marines. It was the worst of times in seeing them get hurt.
In Red, White, Blue, and You, we will discuss the First World War, Vietnam, Desert Storm, and the Global War on Terror. The First World War began in 1914 and lasted through 1918. United States involvement in the First World War began in 1917. We have been given the war diary of Captain Ed Hill of the 304th Engineer Train of the American Expeditionary Forces in France. This diary begins on July 19, 1918, and ends on April 30, 1919. The primary event that started the First World War was the assassination of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. This event, paired with militarism, nationalism, and imperialism, placed two major alliances against each other. The Triple Entente, which included France, Great Britain, and Russia, against the Central Powers, which included Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. There were 40 million casualties in the First World War. The First World War, known as the Great War by the people living at the time, and led to the use of new modern weapons. This included machine guns, flamethrowers, tanks, submarines, airplanes, and poison gas. Now we turn to Captain Ed Hill's diary. War has a major impact on countries around the world, specifically young men who serve, at the risk of losing their life, mind, and body. Captain Ed Hill, in his diary, observes this condition, stating, "On the streets, many old men, 65 and older, perhaps, were working along the streets, and no matter where you looked, you couldn't see any young men. Even the wagons on the streets were driven by women or old men." Some of these men did not want to be on the battlefield. They were young and had their whole lives ahead of them. The average age of a soldier in World War I was 24 years old. Death could find them anywhere, even in a field hospital where they were getting treated for their wounds. Captain Hill reflects on this by saying, "One observation balloon put one battery-wise to the field hospital, which was nearby, and at 3 o'clock they didn't do a thing but murder some of the men. Men that had been wounded and were not fit for fighting were shelled, and I will never forget the sight of those men being killed deliberately. They could be seen flying through the air, and it was a sight to make us boil. But they were getting some of the medicine that they would like to give us all, for they're dead and lying around in fairly large numbers. Even the air was filled with death." Another deadly factor in the war was disease, specifically Spanish flu. An estimated 45,000 American soldiers died of disease by the end of 1918. This is evident in Captain Hill's diary when he states on September 3, 1918, "The fluenza is knocking every outfit in the division. Out of 1,500 men in our division, I heard the surgeon remark that there are 500 of them taken sick in 1 week. The ambulance was working overtime in getting them into hospitals, for not an outfit is being passed by the flu." Reflecting on the death of his comrade, Captain Hill notes that a man's confidence can make all the difference when it comes to returning home. He states, "Lieutenant Easby today received a letter from Leighton Smith's wife asking for particulars in reference to the death of her husband. It was the first notification that we had in reference to Smith, and we had never for a moment thought he had been dead since October 27th. When the lieutenant read that letter, it brought back to me the days that we had spent in Mott's, where many of the times he said that he was going to die over there in France, and he would never make it back to the States. We all believed he would be allowed to date if he had a little confidence in himself.
Now we move into Vietnam. What triggered the Vietnam War was after the North Vietnamese torpedo boats allegedly attacked the USS Maddox and USS Turner Joy in the Gulf of Tonkin. President Johnson ordered the retaliatory bombing of military targets in North Vietnam. The war wasn't just between the U.S. and Vietnam. Australia and New Zealand also fought. The largest contingency of anti-communist forces came from South Korea. The Vietnam War lasted from 1955 to 1975. The U.S. didn't get involved until 1962 to 1973. They were involved for 11 years. The conflicting powers of Vietnam was the communist government of North Vietnam that was against South Vietnam and its principal ally, the U.S. The Vietnam War ended when the North Vietnamese took over Saigon. U.S. casualties were about 58,220. North Vietnamese troop casualties were roughly 1.1 million. South Vietnamese troop casualties were approximately 200,000 to 250,000. And lastly, Vietnamese civilian casualties were an astonishing 2 million.
There's just such a pride in the Marine Corps, in the history, and Marines are just different. We really are. So, why did I choose the Marine Corps? I don't know. I was a guy dared me to do it, and I said, all right, sure. So I went and joined. Relationships with people that truly understand you. You cannot expect somebody to understand that unless they have experienced some of it. At the time, now you've got to understand, 1965, we had hardly ever heard the term Vietnam. We didn't have any idea what was going on about it. There wasn't much on the news or anything. In the service, you have a primary military occupational specialty, an MOS. Mine was supply, but I also had an MOS of infantry. And I was assigned to an artillery battalion as a supply officer. Well, that consisted of driving up and down highways that were not real highways. They were dirt roads, and they were very dangerous. One time heading out, I hit a landmine that did not explode, and I think God was looking after me that day. But I also had other additional duties that carried along with that. And one of them was to be the commanding officer of the Quick Reaction Unit, which meant you would equate it to a SWAT team. When there's some problem going on, that a unit needs help, then we could put together as much as about 120 men. We moved up to the DMZ. In the DMZ, I was in Dong Ha, where we set up at the supply unit. And it was about 7 miles from North Vietnam. And a pretty dangerous place because they could send rockets and mortars into them. And they did. Three miles in 10 minutes. 10-minute miles. That's insane. That's easy. I was running sub-6 sometime. Well, that 135-pound body of mine ended up with about 85-plus pounds of weight on it. We didn't run in tennis shoes. We ran in boots. We ran in with a helmet, full field marching pack, rifles, everything. And when you put about 85 to 90 pounds on somebody's back that weighs 135 pounds, it was difficult. And a lot of people didn't make it. They had to go do it again and again and again until they made it to graduate. That was probably the most difficult single thing. When I was going through PLC program, we lived in Quonset huts, and I was walking with somebody behind somebody, and I was about 5 feet behind them, and my drill sergeant was about 2 or 3 feet over here, standing by the door as we were going in, and this person in front of me walked past a piece of paper lying on the ground. All of a sudden, that drill instructor caused this candidate to stop. And I cannot use the words, but he was chewed out unbelievably bad. He said, "Do you realize you walked past that piece of paper? And if you had any initiative, you would have stopped and picked it up." Now, you carry that word initiative in your life, and you see something that needs to be done, and you do it without being told, that's using initiative. And that's what they want in leaders. That's what they want in corporations.
Colonel Travis Billingsley, he and I flew together and trained together, and he was just a true leader and motivator of me. He was the one that helped me understand one of the great lessons is you got to be there first. If you're going to command, if you're going to lead, you got to be there first. Don't let other people beat you to the office. I'm going to have to reveal some of my flaws. In training, I was afraid of heights, and here I was going to be a pilot. And I'm telling you what, I would get in that airplane and I would be almost paralyzed, but I had to get through it. And so I was having a difficult time soloing. So now soloing is when you go up in that airplane all by yourself. And now in my day, the first airplane we flew was a T-37, which was a twin-engine jet. We didn't have any propellers in front of us, no, light aircraft like they do today. They do a little bit of a slower training session. So I get out there, and the instructor pilot gets out of the airplane, and he says something like, "Showalter, you're going to kill yourself. Can I have your I-5 radio set?" Of course, here I am. I'm really scared to death. So anyway, close the canopy, pour the power to the engine, and then all of a sudden, now I'm out in Oklahoma. It's 105 degrees outside. And all of a sudden, smoke starts coming out of the vents in the plane. And I think, I'm on fire. Oh my goodness, what am I going to do? But I wasn't going to let anybody know that I was afraid of catching on fire. He just told me I'm going to die anyway, so why don't I just go ahead and get blown up when the plane. So anyway, I poured the coals to it. Well, it turns out that was because of the heat. That was vapor coming off the air conditioning system on the plane. Especially over in the combat zone, we would play all kinds of crazy games. There was one we called carrier landings, and we would wet down the officers' club barroom floor, and we'd get service trays, the cafeteria service trays, and we'd go running across the floor that's wet and slick, and we would slide toward the exit door, and we'd turn our feet out and catch it on the frame of the door, because if we didn't catch it, we went out into the mud. So that's the kind of stuff. And I mean, everybody's hooting and hollering and saying, yeah, you made a good landing. But that built esprit de corps. That built camaraderie, and we're having fun and getting to know one another at the same time. Okay. I think a number of things come into to play there. First of all, faith, and faith in a higher being, faith that somehow you're being protected, but that faith also goes with your fellow pilots, because we were in tough situations. We were seeing people, and I don't want to be morbid here, but we lost 28 pilots in a period of 10 months while I was over there. That's out of a squadron of 40 pilots. So we were losing pilots every day. And you see, flying in a formation, you see a anti-aircraft shell come up and blow up the plane that's right next to you. And you have to have faith that you're doing the job to the best of your ability and everybody else is doing it. So you got to have, in my case, the faith in God. Then you got to have faith in your fellow pilots, so that you know that they are doing the best job that they know how. Well, I think one of the things that you have to look toward in military service, it's not a sacrifice. It's an honor. It's an honor to serve your country. It's an honor to be part of a bigger mission. And so I never looked at it as a sacrifice. There are probably times that I don't know the word we would use here, but would complain maybe vehemently about the service, but I didn't see it as a sacrifice. And I look back on it now, and I am very fortunate to have lived through that combat, but I didn't see it as a sacrifice. I saw it as an honor to serve.
Well, and personally, I felt a debt for having grown up in freedom. And the Vietnam War was going on, and so I felt joining the military was my way of being able to repay that debt for having grown up in a free society. Part of me thinks that people, there's a phrase, a natural born leader, and I think partially that's true. But my experience in the Corps, and I was what we call a rifle platoon commander when I was in Vietnam, and so I had the daily responsibility for approximately 60 people in their lives every day. And that experience, I remember once saying that I was so mentally and physically exhausted at the end of my year in Vietnam. I'd gone from 177 pounds to 148 pounds, and just averaging about 4 hours sleep a day. That it was a very taxing experience physically and mentally, but it also honed the leadership skills that I think are so important in combat. It certainly shaped my perspective on devotion to others, and my family that had military experience other than my father playing in an Air Force band in World War II. Ironically, my brother, who I mentioned earlier, we joined the military at about the same time. I was in the Marine Corps. My brother was a C-141 pilot in the Air Force. And so the military, I felt for my mom. Her two sons were in the war, and she was a widow. And so she had the agony of going through the war, not knowing what was going to happen to her two sons. And it's funny, the conversations I've had with my brother. My brother would fly into Da Nang and drop a load in Da Nang and then fly back to Kadena Air Force Base in Okinawa. And he would look down on the ground and see all these tracer rounds going back and forth and thinking, my little brother's down there. And I would be on an ambush site and looking up in the air and seeing the lights of these jets flying over and saying, my big brother's up there somewhere. So he and I both acquired a military perspective, and I think that's a good thing. Obviously, so many of the young men and women that served in the Vietnam War endured totally undeserved ridicule by members of the American public. When politicians sent them to war and all they did was honor their commitment to the military. They were not to blame at all, and it was tragic to see that. I, on the other hand, was treated almost like a hero in my church. I was asked by my pastor to speak at the church one Sunday morning in my Marine dress blues, and I remember speaking, and I was so stunned that when I finished, there were probably 1,500 people in the audience, and every one of them stood and gave me a standing ovation. And so I was treated almost like a hero, and the people that I returned to, as opposed to, my friend Ed Hagen. We initially talked about this. He went back to his church, and actually was a priest. He was Roman Catholic, and the priest called him a baby killer. And I think maybe that somewhat led to his depression about the war. But like I said, I was treated wonderfully. Is lean on others. Learn to communicate and express yourself. The worst thing that you can do is hold it inside and allow yourself to go down that spiral of depression that can lead to self-harm or the harm of others. History repeats itself, and it's important for this generation to learn from the mistakes that my generation made.
Actually, nurses had it pretty easy for basic training. The WACs, had to do calisthenics and run, and I just had to learn to salute and march. And probably the biggest challenge was going into what they called Camp Bullis, where we had learned to read maps, and we had to find our way out. And but they had helicopters to save us if we got lost. But we made it out. The other challenge was learning about Army nursing and the types of patients that you might treat. Learning how to do procedures that I had never learned in nursing school. We had to do tracheotomies on goats because they have a long neck, so many could do it. We had to learn how to debride wounds, so things that I never learned in basic nursing school. So that was challenging. That was very important. I did learn teamwork. We had to work together, and and leadership again. I learned to be charge nurse. I learned to take control. I learned to manage other people and help them learn also. So it was a very positive experience. It's very interesting. Sadly, returning home from Vietnam for any Vietnam veteran was difficult because unfortunately our country did not support what we were doing there. So nursing for me after coming home was not good for me. It was, and other nurses who served in Vietnam. We did so much there. We had so much more leverage. And when I came home, number one, we did not tell anyone we'd been there. Number two, I was bored to death. But I didn't want other nurses that I worked with to know that, because I didn't want them to think I thought I was better than them. That wasn't the case at all. It's just that it was so intense and such a great learning experience. But I could not tell anyone that I worked with that I had been there. Everything. Everything. I had never experienced the types of wounds and injuries and trauma in the prior years that because I only had about 6 months experience before I was sent to Vietnam. And nothing at all could have trained us for what we learned to take care of and deal with. I cannot speak for all of the wonderful women that served that were not nurses. Interestingly, here's the situation. When I was deployed, I flew to the West Coast. My flight was not until the next day. So I went to the bachelor officers' quarters, and I was told that there were no rooms for women. So somehow I put myself together and stood up straighter and said, "Excuse me, you're sending me to Vietnam. I believe you will find a room for me." And he did. As I can only speak, there was a lot of sexual harassment for women in the military, which is shameful. But overall, while I was there, I was treated with respect. So.
Our next conflict is Desert Storm. Operation Desert Storm started on January 17, 1991, and ended on February 28, 1991. The ground fighting lasted about 100 hours, but the airstrikes continued for about 6 weeks. The U.S. led a coalition of 34 countries to help stop Iraq. Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein, versus a coalition led by the U.S., including countries like the UK and France. The fight took place mainly in Kuwait and Iraq. Iraq invaded Kuwait to take control of its oil and because of economic problems. The war ended with a quick victory for the coalition. A ceasefire was declared on February 28, 1991. After the coalition forces pushed Iraqi troops out of Kuwait, Saddam Hussein stayed in power, but Kuwait was freed.
I guess it would be kind of a combination of at times you feel like you're doing everything on your own, even though you're in a large group sometimes doing it, and it's things that were completely new. I received training at Chanute Air Force Base in Illinois. My job was a fuel specialist, so we handled any and all fuel movement on the base. Was our primary objectives and jobs. We also handled all the liquid oxygen, liquid nitrogen. The liquid oxygen also created what's called AVBO, which is the oxygen, the pure, extremely purified oxygen that pilots use in the aircraft. And we actually had our what they call a LOX and Lin plant and produced that on base. And then along with not just handling the fuel and transferring and fueling aircraft, but we did all the accounting for the fuel. We did all the lab work, testing for purity and safety, and all the minor maintenance on all our equipment and everything. So it was a fairly broad field. Once you're in the military, if someone's never been in the military, they can't relate to what you're doing, what you're going through on a day-to-day kind of basis, whether it's good or bad. So you tend to kind of, as the saying goes, birds of a feather flock together. And so you tend to stay with people that you can relate to and swap stories about and swap stories with, or complain about your boss with, and things like that. To look and trying to prioritize things. The military, the way things are done in the military, are very cut and dry. Especially for day-to-day operations of everything, you are literally given a book of what you're going to do that day, how it goes down. Every single aspect of it has been written out and spelled out for you, because over the years they've learned this is hate to say the best way, but this is the way that we do it. Their instructions were not always the best way, but it was how it got done. Especially with the deployments overseas and things, is it really changed, I guess, sort of the worldview, which came back to a much smaller scale to how you view things locally. A great example, I think, is what we see in the news now is how horrible Muslims are. Everybody wants to down the Muslims and things like that. And I spent 6 months living in a Muslim country in Saudi Arabia, and they were overall some of the nicest people I'd ever met. They were very friendly, very welcoming. They're very different. Their lifestyle is very different than how most of us live. They are extremely dedicated to their religion. And as long as you show respect for that, not necessarily have to get involved, but just show respect. What they ask is what they deem as respect for it. And they're very nice people. They would offer, always willing to offer tea or laugh or joke or something like that. And and it was the same with other countries. Once you learn about other cultures, from the outside looking in, their culture seems, or may seem odd or weird or something to us because we're so accustomed to what we have. And then you get to another country and actually get immersed in their culture and find out it makes a lot more sense then, and you get a better understanding. And then to come back in the States and start trying to view other people that you meet that same way, that they act different because they were raised different, even if it's within the United States. They were just raised different and had, their own small cultures or subcultures. And to learn there's lots of different people in the world, lots of different lifestyles, and to get to go and experience it firsthand, it really has if you open your eyes and pay attention to it, it really has a profound effect on how you view the rest of the world and everything around you.
Well, it's a whole new experience. You're in a whole different state. You're out of your element. So I was in San Antonio, Texas. I was in the Air Force. It's a whole different world. you realized real quick that you weren't in charge of your life. Well, personally, it made a man out of me. It made me realize there's more things in life than just me. Honestly, I think if I'm not going to say everybody went into the military, they would have a whole different perspective on what we stand for as a country.
And now we will discuss the global war on terror. The United States got involved in the war after the September 11th terrorist attacks in 2001. At the time, President George W. Bush created a plan to search and put a stop to terrorists all around the world. This conflict would continue for 20 years until the final pullout of Afghanistan that occurred on August 30th, 2021. The main opponents were Al-Qaeda of Afghanistan and the Iraqi forces. On May 2nd, 2011, Osama bin Laden was killed by the U.S. Navy SEAL Team 6 in a special operations raid at an Al-Qaeda compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan early in the morning. The entire operation only lasted 40 minutes from start to finish, but the planning and training took years of preparation.
I guess, it's just trying to do everything with lack of sleep and food. And just trying to learn the skill set while under a lot of stress. That's for the most part. I wouldn't say it was anything too difficult, but they're just always hungry and always tired. I put more trust in the people around me and less trust in, higher, like our government leadership and things like that, thinking that they knew what was, they knew or thought they were doing what was best. I assumed they were doing what was best for everyone, and it wasn't the case. So now I kind of have a more localized, immediate the major cities like Baghdad, like it was a lot, not as nice as our cities, but there still is like some areas where, like the university area was, it looked like any other college that you see. But then now the smaller towns, it's like, they like the big cities like Baghdad, they have restaurants, they have all this stuff. It's like a normal city, except for the buildings aren't as nice, basically, but it's just as big. And then there are some really nice buildings that are very much similar to stuff in the United States or in Europe or whatever. And then you get out to these towns are, and it's just desert. There's dry everything. Because down in southern Iraq, back before the war ever happened, Saddam cut off the water to southern Iraq. And they used to be able to grow food, all this stuff like that, and it's just arid. And it's just, they have the Euphrates River down there, but it's nothing to write home about, It's not, they cut off all the irrigation, basically, to everything. Just dirt. They're happy we were there.
I think all of us have some type of obligation to our country. And there are ways that you can serve your country without going in the military. Of course, we had to deal with the draft. If you were eligible, you went in the military. But you could select, before you got drafted, what branch you could volunteer for the branch you wanted to do. And that's what I did, and was lucky to get in the Coast Guard. But I think it's important that, I'll use a phrase, I think we all understand that all of us have some skin in the game for our country.
one is you're going to hear the true story from us. The rest of it, we're not going to give you propaganda. We're not going to gaslight stuff. We're not going to make up stories and either to sway you one way or the other. We weren't baby killers, and number two, we weren't saints. This is reality, and reality of taking care of patients. Doesn't matter whether I'm in the military. Doesn't matter whether I'm in Atlanta, Georgia, Highlands, North Carolina. Doesn't matter. We just do our job. The mission was to take care of people. All we wanted to accomplish the mission.
Because there's people, I think, getting out of high school that they don't really know what they want to do. You know, they don't know if they want to go to college. They don't know where they want to work, what they want to do. And I think the military service can teach you very valuable skills. And on top of valuable skills, they will prepare you for a later decision if you want to go to college, and then they help you by giving you the GI Bill and money to go to school.
Ceremonial Guard Company is a group of Marines, a detachment of Marines, who does all the ceremonial duties in Washington, D.C. If a dignitary flies in, the Ceremonial Guard Company meets the dignitary. If there's a funeral at Arlington, we conduct that funeral. If there's a major funeral, I was blessed in the fact that I was part of the Marine Corps Silent Precision Drill Team. So we were selected primarily for most of the higher profile assignments. In other words, as my sweatshirt indicates, I was one of the few Marines, 53 of us, who were selected to bury John Kennedy, the President of the United States at the time, who was assassinated in Dallas. A little bit later, I was assigned to go to New York City, to live in New York City for a while, where we conducted the funeral for former President Hoover. And I then, later on that same year, one of the most famous generals in the world died, General Douglas MacArthur. So we were then dispatched to go to Norfolk, Virginia, and we rode the train with him rode with that body for about 200 miles through the country. And what was interesting about that for me is that all along the train route, all along the tracks, people stood, saluted, put their hand over their heart to honor Douglas MacArthur. They cried. Everything was almost like the Kennedy funeral. Everywhere we went, people were crying.